Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. My mother used to work as a nurse. I found about her secret operation in Area 51 on the deep web. Growing up, my mother was always my hero. She was the kind of person who could make a scraped knee feel better with just a kiss, who'd stay up all night when I was sick, and who always had the right words to comfort me when the world seemed too big and scary. She was a nurse, and I always thought that her job was just as normal as anyone else's, but there were things about her that didn't quite fit the usual nurse stereotype. One, she never talked about her work. Ever. Even as a kid, I remember asking her what she did at the hospital, and she'd just smile and say something vague like, just helping people. And when I pressed her for details, she'd change the subject, or suddenly remember that she had to do something else. I guess I never really thought much about it because, she was my mom. Why would she lie? But as I got older, little things started to nag at me, like how she'd get these weird phone calls at odd hours and disappear into her room to take them, or how she'd sometimes come home looking more exhausted than usual, with this haunted look in her eyes. I chalked it up to the stress of working in healthcare, especially since she always seemed to be doing night shifts. But there was this small nagging part of me that knew something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until after she passed away last year that I started to uncover the truth. She had a stroke, sudden and devastating. One day she was here, and the next she was gone. Cleaning out her house was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. It felt wrong, like I was invading her privacy, going through her things. But someone had to do it, and it ended up being me. That's when I found it. I was sorting through her closet, trying to figure out what to keep and what to donate, when I found an old box tucked away in the back corner. It was dusty, like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside were all sorts of things I'd never seen before. Old letters, photos, and a bunch of documents. Most of it seemed pretty standard at first glance, but then I noticed something strange. There were files labeled with odd code names and a series of numbers that didn't make any sense to me. Curiosity got the better of me, so I started reading through them. The more I read, the more confused I became. The documents were filled with medical jargon, references to classified experiments, and places I'd never heard of. And then I found something that made my heart skip a beat. A document with the heading, Operation Delta Echo, Area 51. I remember laughing at first, thinking it was some kind of joke. Area 51, like the secret military base? The place where conspiracy theorists say the government is hiding aliens? It seemed too ridiculous to be real. But the more I read, the more I realized this wasn't a joke. The files were detailed, clinical, and disturbingly real. They described experiments on, I'm still not entirely sure what, but it wasn't normal. I knew I had to learn more, but I didn't know where to start. A Google search wasn't going to cut it, not with something like this. So I did something I probably shouldn't have. I started poking around the deep web. I had heard stories about it, of course, but I'd never been down that rabbit hole myself. It was supposed to be a place where you could find anything, no matter how dark or secret. And I figured, if there was anywhere to find out what my mum had been involved in, it was there. I won't lie, I was scared. The deep web has a reputation, and it's not a good one. But my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I downloaded Tor, set up a VPN, and started searching. It was like diving into a pitch-black ocean, not knowing what might be lurking in the depths. I spent hours sifting through forums and message boards, looking for anything that might connect to the documents I'd found. At first, it was just the usual conspiracy nonsense. People claiming to have seen UFOs, stories about government cover-ups. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. A forum post titled Operation Delta Echo, The Truth Behind Area 51. The post was long, detailed, and filled with information that matched what I'd seen in my mother's files. It talked about secret experiments, about things being done to people that shouldn't even be possible. And at the bottom of the post, there was a link that claimed to lead to evidence, videos, documents, all sorts of things that were supposedly proof of what was really happening at Area 51. I hesitated for a long time before clicking that link. Something about it felt wrong, like I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. But in the end, I did it. I clicked the link, and my screen went black for a moment. Then a new page loaded, filled with files I could download. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything changed. The moment I started to uncover the truth about what my mother was really involved in. The truth about what was really happening at Area 51. And believe me, you're not ready for what I found. I've never been one to scare easily, but when that page loaded and I saw the list of files, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The names of the files were vague, things like Experiment _13A, Subject _21X, and Procedure _log. But there was something about the way they were listed, the cold clinical nature of it all, that made my skin prickle with unease. I started downloading the files one by one, my heart racing with a mix of anticipation and dread. I didn't know what I was about to uncover, but deep down, I had a feeling it wasn't going to be good. When the downloads finished, I took a deep breath and opened the first video file. The footage was grainy, like it had been filmed on an old security camera, and it showed a stark white room, the kind you'd expect to see in a hospital or a laboratory. There was a metal table in the center, and on that table was a person. At least I think it was a person. It was hard to tell because of the way they were strapped down, their body completely still, except for the occasional twitch. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell something was wrong with them, something unnatural. A voice crackled over the audio, distorted and low, almost robotic. Subject 21X, Day 14, commencing neural interface protocol. The camera zoomed in, and I saw wires, dozens of them, attached to the subject's head, leading to a machine just off camera. The machine started humming, and the subject's body jerked violently. I could hear their muffled screams, just faint, agonized sounds through the speakers, and my stomach churned. The video ended abruptly, cutting to black. I sat there staring at my screen, trying to process what I'd just seen. This wasn't some horror movie. This was real. Those screams were real. I wanted to stop, to shut my laptop, and forget I'd ever found that box in my mother's closet. But I couldn't. Something inside me needed to know more. So I opened the next file, and then the next, each one worse than the last. The video showed more experiments, people being subjected to things I couldn't even begin to understand. One video showed a man being injected with some kind of black fluid, his veins bulging and turning dark as it spread through his body. Another showed a woman who had been put through what looked like endless cycles of sleep deprivation, her eyes wild and unfocused, her hands clawing at the air as if trying to grasp something that wasn't there. Each experiment seemed more twisted, more inhuman than the last. But it wasn't just the experiments that were horrifying. It was the people conducting them. Their voices, cold and detached, spoke about the subjects as if they were nothing more than lab rats. No hint of empathy, no remorse. Just a job to be done, results to be documented. One file stood out among the rest. It wasn't a video, but a document, a report on something called Project Epsilon. The report described it as the culmination of years of research into something called cognitive reconfiguration. I didn't understand all of the technical terms, but the gist of it was clear. They were trying to change the way people thought, to rewrite their minds somehow. The implications of that were terrifying. The last line of the report sent a shiver down my spine. Further testing required to ensure stability. Subject remains unresponsive to external stimuli. I had to take a break after that, stepping away from my laptop and pacing around the room, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. What the hell had my mother been involved in? This wasn't just some secret government project. This was something darker, something evil. The thought that she might have known about all of this, that she might have been a part of it, made my stomach turn. But there was another part of me, the part that still remembered her as the loving, caring woman who raised me, that refused to believe it. There had to be an explanation, something that made all of this make sense. I forced myself to go back to the files, to dig deeper. But as I did, I started to notice something strange. Little things at first. Static in the videos, odd glitches in the audio. But then, something more. Faces in the background of the videos that I could have sworn weren't there before. Shadows that seemed to move on their own. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was seeing things because I was tired and stressed. But the more I watched, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched in return. Like there was something in those files, something aware, something that knew I was looking. The final file I opened that night was another video. This one was different from the others. It was shorter, just a few minutes long, and the camera angle was strange, like it had been set up in a hurry. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb overhead. At first, I couldn't make out what I was seeing, but then the camera adjusted, and I saw her, my mother. She was sitting in a chair, her face pale and drawn, her eyes fixed on something off camera. She looked scared, more scared than I'd ever seen her. A voice spoke, low and menacing. "You know too much, Mary. We warned you." My mother didn't respond, just kept staring at whatever was in front of her. The voice spoke again, but I couldn't make out what it said. There was too much static, too much interference. But I didn't need to hear it to know what was happening. I could see it in her eyes, the resignation, the fear. The video cut out suddenly, leaving me staring at a black screen. I sat there in the darkness, my heart pounding, trying to process what I had just seen. That was my mother, and she was terrified. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finally moved, it was like coming out of a trance. I was shaking, cold, and my mind was racing with questions. What had she gotten herself into? Who were these people, and what did they do to her? I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stop until I found out, no matter how deep this rabbit hole went. I had to know the truth, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I was uncovering, whatever secrets I was digging up, were things that should have stayed buried, and that maybe, just maybe, I'd already gone too far. days that followed were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything else. Work, friends, even eating. All I could think about was what I'd found, the images and sounds looping endlessly in my mind. My mother, sitting in that dark room, the fear in her eyes, the experiments, the inhuman things they were doing to people. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But nightmares, I told myself, were just that, dreams. This was real, and I was determined to find out the truth, no matter how much it scared me. I started to dig deeper, going back to the forums and message boards on the deep web, trying to find anyone who might know more about Project Epsilon or Operation Delta Echo. Most of what I found was more conspiracy theory junk, but every now and then I had come across something that felt different, like a puzzle piece that almost fit. One post, in particular, caught my eye. It was buried deep in a thread titled Government Experiments, What They Don't Want You to Know. The post was long and rambling, written by someone who claimed to be an ex-military scientist. Most of it was the usual paranoia, but then there was a paragraph that stood out. Area 51 isn't just about aliens. That's the smokescreen. The real work is darker, buried in sublevels that don't officially exist. They're not just researching extraterrestrials. They're messing with the human mind, trying to unlock things that should stay locked. Project Epsilon is just one of many. If you're reading this, it's probably too late for you. They know when you know. I read that last line over and over, the words sinking in like a stone in my gut. They know when you know. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. But then I thought about the glitches, the strange things I'd been seeing in the files, and that creeping sensation of being watched. Was it possible? Was there something or someone tracking me? I couldn't stop now, though. I needed answers, and I was willing to take the risk to get them. So I did the only thing I could think of. I started contacting people. I found an encrypted email address in the forum post, buried in a mess of text, and sent a message. I didn't expect a response, but to my surprise, I got one almost immediately. The reply was brief, just an address and a time. No explanation, no signature. The address was local, just a few towns over. I remember staring at the email, my hands trembling. This was it. I was about to step into the unknown, into something that felt dangerous, even deadly. But if this was a way to learn the truth, I had to take it. The address turned out to be a rundown, almost abandoned-looking warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you drive past 100 times and never notice. I arrived at the time specified, 2 a.m. of course, and parked a little way down the street. The place was dark, the only light coming from a single dim bulb above the door. I sat in my car for a long time, trying to convince myself to go in. Every instinct was telling me to turn around, to get out of there and forget the whole thing. But I couldn't. I needed to know what my mother had been involved in, what had happened to her. When I finally stepped out of the car, the cold night air hit me like a slap, waking me up from the fog of fear that had been clouding my mind. I walked up to the door, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, and knocked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open, just a crack, and a figure appeared in the shadows. "Are you the one asking about Project Epsilon?" The voice was low, gravelly, with a hint of suspicion. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. The door opened wider, and I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The warehouse was dark, the only light coming from a small, flickering lamp on a metal table in the center of the room. The man who had opened the door was tall, his face hidden in the shadows of a hood. "I don't know how you found out," he said, motioning for me to sit at the table, "but you're in way over your head." I sat down, feeling the cold metal of the chair seep into my bones. I found some documents, videos. My mother, she was involved in something. Project Epsilon. I need to know what it is, what they did to her. The man sat down across from me, his face still obscured. Project Epsilon was never supposed to see the light of day. It was classified, off the books. Only a handful of people even knew it existed, and those who did, well, let's just say they didn't stick around for long. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. He leaned forward, and for the first time I saw his eyes, hollow, haunted. "Your mother, she wasn't just a nurse. She was brought in because she was good, the best. They needed someone who could handle the aftermath, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions, but she did. She saw things that broke people, and when she started asking questions, they made sure she couldn't ask anymore." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mother, involved in this nightmare, forced to stay silent. I could barely process it. What were they doing? What was Project Epsilon? He hesitated, like he was deciding whether to tell me the truth or not. Project Epsilon was an attempt to control the human mind, to erase memories, implant new ones, even control behavior. They thought they could create the perfect soldier, someone who could be programmed like a machine, but it went wrong. The subjects, they didn't just lose their memories, they lost themselves. They became something else, and when they couldn't be controlled, they were disposed of. I felt sick, the room spinning around me. "Disposed of? You mean they were killed?" He nodded. "Or worse. Some of them, they were kept, experimented on further. Your mother tried to stop it, tried to get the word out, but they got to her first." I sat there in stunned silence, the truth crashing down on me like a wave. My mother had been trying to do the right thing, to stop something horrible, and it had cost her everything. But there was one more thing I needed to know. "Is she dead?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did they kill her?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost pitying. "She's not dead, but she's not your mother anymore. Whatever they did to her, it changed her. She's not the person you knew." The words echoed in my head, my worst fear confirmed. My mother was alive, but she wasn't herself. I felt tears burning in my eyes, but I blinked them back, refusing to break down in front of this stranger. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How do I stop them?" He shook his head. "You can't stop them. They're too powerful, too entrenched. All you can do is survive. Leave this alone. Forget what you've learned. It's the only way to stay safe." But I knew, deep down, that I couldn't do that. I couldn't just walk away, not after everything I'd seen, everything I'd learned. My mother was out there somewhere, trapped in whatever hell these people had created, and I couldn't abandon her. I stood up, my mind made up. I'm going to find her, and I'm going to make them pay for what they did. The man didn't try to stop me. He just watched me, his eyes full of a sadness I couldn't quite understand. "I wish you luck," he said quietly. "But be careful. They're always watching." I nodded, turning to leave. But as I reached the door, I felt a strange sensation, like a prickling at the back of my neck. I glanced back, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in the shadows. something moving, watching. I stepped out into the cold night, the door closing behind me with a final echoing thud. I knew now that there was no going back, no returning to the life I had before. The truth was out there, and I was going to find it, no matter what it cost me. But as I drove away from that warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that whatever I'd uncovered was only the beginning, and that the real horror was still waiting, lurking in the darkness just out of sight. I don't remember much about the drive home that night. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, too tangled to make sense of. I kept seeing my mother's face, her eyes hollow and terrified, as if she knew what was coming. The man's words echoed in my head. She's not your mother anymore. The reality of it hit me over and over, like waves crashing on a shore. Whatever they had done to her, whatever Project Epsilon was, it had taken her from me. I couldn't just let that be the end of it. I knew that if I didn't act, if I didn't try to save her, I'd never be able to live with myself. But where was I supposed to start? All I had were fragments of information, vague clues that led to more questions than answers. When I got home, I went straight to my laptop, ignoring the exhaustion weighing me down. I knew there was something more hidden in those files, something I'd missed. I went back through them, opening each one, analyzing every detail. The glitches, the shadows, the static. It all seemed deliberate, like someone was trying to hide something, or maybe trying to reveal it. I played one of the videos again, the one where my mother had appeared in that dark room. I watched it frame by frame, looking for anything out of place. And then I saw it, a flash of something in the corner of the screen, barely visible. I paused the video and zoomed in as much as I could. It was a symbol carved into the wall behind her, a triangle with an eye in the center, surrounded by what looked like ancient script. I'd seen that symbol before, but I couldn't remember where. My pulse quickened as I realized this might be a lead, something to guide me through the darkness. I took a screenshot of the symbol and started searching. I scoured forums, archives, anything that might explain what it was. Hours passed, the night turning into morning, but I barely noticed. I was too focused, too determined. Finally, I found something. The symbol was linked to an old secret society, one that supposedly had ties to various government projects throughout history. The society was known as the Ophidian Order, a name that sent chills down my spine. The more I read, the more I realized this was no ordinary group. They were rumored to be behind some of the most controversial and shadowy operations in history, always staying in the background, pulling strings. But there was more. According to the information I found, the Ophidian Order was believed to be involved in mind control experiments as far back as the Cold War, with a particular interest in altering human perception and reality itself. Project Epsilon wasn't the first, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. I couldn't help but wonder, was this who my mother had been working for, unknowingly or not? And if so, were they the ones who had done this to her? My search led me to a name, Dr. Emery Calloway. He was mentioned in several of the documents I found, always linked to the most extreme and unethical experiments. Calloway was a ghost. No trace of him anywhere in the official records. But there were whispers, rumors, that he was still alive, still working in the shadows. And if anyone knew what had happened to my mother, it was him. Finding Calloway wasn't going to be easy. He was off the grid, no public presence, nothing that could lead me to him directly. But I wasn't about to give up. I reached out to the man from the warehouse again, hoping he might have more information. This time, he wasn't as forthcoming. His reply was brief, almost dismissive. "Don't go off to Callaway. You're playing with fire." But that only made me more determined. I needed to find him, to confront him, to get answers. I dug deeper, following every lead, no matter how small. Eventually, I found a trace, buried in an old government contract, a research facility listed under a fake name in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place that didn't exist on any map. It took some doing, but I managed to track it down. The facility was located deep in the desert, miles from civilization, the perfect place to hide something or someone that wasn't supposed to be found. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I couldn't risk it. The less people knew, the safer they'd be. I packed what I needed and set out, the drive long and tense, the landscape growing more desolate with each passing mile. The closer I got, the more the anxiety gnawed at me, but I forced it down, focusing on the task ahead. When I finally reached the facility, it was just as I'd imagined, an imposing structure surrounded by barbed wire and security cameras with no signs of life. But I'd come too far to turn back now. Getting inside wasn't easy, but I'd come prepared. I bypassed the security systems, making my way through the dark, silent corridors, my heart pounding in my chest. The place felt abandoned, but I knew better. Places like this didn't just get left behind. They were left to fester, to hide the things the world wasn't supposed to see. I found a terminal in one of the control rooms, old but still functional. After some searching, I pulled up the facility's records. There it was, Project Epsilon, and a name, Subject 9. My breath caught in my throat. Subject 9 was my mother. I accessed the files, reading through reports, video logs, anything I could find. They'd done things to her. Horrible things. Things I could barely comprehend. They'd tried to rewrite her mind, erase her memories, turn her into something else. But it hadn't worked. She'd resisted, fought back, and they'd deemed her a failure, something to be discarded. But then I found something even worse. Recent activity. My mother wasn't dead. They'd moved her, along with several other subjects, to a new location for further testing. The location was redacted, but there was a note. Subject 9 shows signs of cognitive retention. Potential for reactivation. Reactivation. The words sent a chill down my spine. They were planning to use her again, to experiment on her until there was nothing left. I had to stop them, but I had no idea where they had taken her. Just as I was about to lose hope, I noticed something, a small encrypted file tucked away in the corner of the system. I cracked it open, my fingers shaking. Inside was a single line of text, an address, and a date. The address was close, not far from the facility, and the date was today. Panic surged through me. They were going to move her today, and if I didn't get there in time, I might lose her forever. I grabbed my things and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, fear and determination driving me forward. I didn't know what I'd find when I got there, but I knew one thing for sure. This was my last chance. If I failed, my mother would be lost to me forever, swallowed by the darkness that had taken her from me. As I sped through the desert, the sun dipping low on the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was racing against something far more dangerous than just time. I was descending into something dark, something that had been waiting for me all along. And whatever it was ready to greet me with open arms. The desert road seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the horizon blurring with the dusky sky. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was getting to that address, finding my mother, and putting an end to this nightmare once and for all. When I finally arrived, the place looked nothing like what I'd expected. It wasn't another ominous facility or a hidden underground bunker. It was an old, decrepit farmhouse, isolated and surrounded by miles of empty desert. The kind of place you'd never give a second glance to, but that's exactly why it was perfect for hiding something or someone. I parked a short distance away and approached cautiously, the silence of the desert pressing down on me like a weight. The air was thick with tension, every step I took feeling like it echoed into the void. As I got closer, I noticed that the house wasn't as abandoned as it appeared. The windows were boarded up, but there was a faint light coming from inside, a soft, eerie glow that made the shadows dance. I crept around the back, hoping to find a way in without alerting anyone. The door was old, the wood rotting, and it gave way easily with a quiet creak. The interior was dark, the only illumination coming from that same strange light, seeping through the cracks in the walls and under the doors. The air was stale, thick with dust and something else, something metallic, like the scent of blood. I moved through the house as quietly as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. The place was a maze of narrow hallways and empty rooms, each one more dilapidated than the last. But there was something about it, something that made my skin crawl. It felt like the house was watching me, like the walls themselves were alive, pulsing with some dark energy. Finally, I found what I was looking for. A heavy door at the end of a long hallway, reinforced and locked. I hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at me, but I forced myself to keep going. I needed to see this through, no matter what was on the other side. The lock was old, and with a little effort, I managed to force it open. The door swung inward with a groan, revealing a dimly lit staircase descending into the earth. The light was stronger now, flickering, almost like it was alive, and it cast long, twisting shadows on the walls. I could hear something too, a low humming noise, like machinery, mixed with faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I descended the stairs, each step feeling like it was taking me deeper into the bowels of the earth, further away from the world I knew. The air grew colder, and the smell intensified, that same metallic tang, mixed with something rotting. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a long, narrow corridor lined with doors. Each door had a small window, and as I passed them, I couldn't resist the urge to look inside. The rooms were small, bare, and empty, except for one thing. Each room had a chair, and in each chair sat a person, or at least something that had once been a person. Their eyes were vacant, their bodies motionless, like they were in some kind of trance. Wires ran from their heads to machines in the corners of the rooms, machines that hummed softly, their lights blinking in rhythm with the whispers that filled the air. My heart raced as I realized what I was seeing. These were the subjects of Project Epsilon, the people whose minds had been erased, reprogrammed, turned into something less than human. And my mother was somewhere among them. I moved faster now, panic clawing at me as I checked each room, praying that I wouldn't find her there, connected to one of those machines. But as I reached the end of the corridor, I knew, deep down, that I would. The last door was different. It was heavier, reinforced like the one upstairs, and the light inside was stronger, almost blinding. I looked through the window and saw her, my mother, strapped to a chair, wires attached to her head, just like the others. But there was something different about her. She was awake, her eyes wide open, but they weren't vacant. They were filled with something else: fear, desperation, and a glimmer of recognition. I fumbled with the door, my hands shaking, and finally managed to get it open. I rushed inside, calling out to her, but she didn't respond. She just stared at me, her eyes following my every move, but her body completely still. I tried to pull the wires off her, but they were embedded deep. The metal fused with her skin in a way that made me sick to my stomach. "Mom, it's me," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm going to get you out of here." She blinked slowly, as if the words took a moment to sink in. Then finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." "I'm going to save you," I insisted, pulling at the restraints, trying to free her. But they wouldn't budge. "No," she said more forcefully this time, her eyes filling with tears. "You need to leave. Now, before they come." "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. As if in response, the whispers around us grew louder, more insistent, and the machines began to hum more aggressively. The light in the room flickered, and I felt a presence, something dark and malevolent, moving closer. I realized then that this was a trap, that the moment I'd stepped into this house, I'd set something in motion, something that couldn't be stopped. "They're already here," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. I turned around, and for the first time, I saw them, shadows, moving in the corners of the room, coalescing into forms that were almost human, but not quite. They had no faces, just smooth, dark surfaces where their features should have been, and they moved with an unnatural, jerky motion that made my skin crawl. I backed away, instinctively putting myself between them and my mother. "What are they?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Failed experiments," she said, her voice hollow. "They were supposed to be perfect, controllable, but they broke, and now they're coming for us." I looked at her, panic surging through me. "We have to go, Mom. We have to leave now." But she shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't. It's too late for me. But you still have a chance. You need to run. Go before they take you too." "I'm not leaving you," I cried, my voice breaking. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched my face gently. "You have to. You need to live, to tell the world what happened here. Promise me you'll keep going." I didn't want to leave her. Every part of me screamed to stay, to fight, to do whatever I could to save her. But I could see it in her eyes. There was no saving her. Whatever they had done, it had already taken too much. "I promise," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. She nodded, a small, sad smile on her lips. "I love you. Now go." With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned to it and ran, out of the room, down the corridor, up the stairs, and out into the night. The shadows followed. I could feel them, closing in on me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until I couldn't drive anymore, until the sun was rising on the horizon, and the house was just a distant memory. But the truth was, it would never be just a memory. What I had seen, what I had learned, it would haunt me for the rest of my life. My mother was gone, lost to the darkness of Project Epsilon and the horrors it had created. But she had given me one last gift, the chance to live, to escape the fate that had befallen her. And I would keep my promise. I would tell the world what happened, expose the truth of the experiments, the people who had been destroyed by them, and the darkness that lurked behind the lies. But even now, as I sit here, writing this, I can feel it, an itch at the back of my mind, a presence just out of sight. They're still out there, watching, waiting, and they know that I know. I don't know how much time I have left, but I'll keep fighting, I'll keep running, because I know that if I stop, if I let my guard down for even a moment, they'll find me. And when they do, I'll become just another experiment, another lost soul, trapped in the darkness forever. It all started innocently enough, like any other college friendship. You meet someone in class, you get along, and before you know it, you're hanging out after lectures, grabbing food, and doing all the usual stuff that college buddies do. That's how it was with James. James wasn't the type to stand out in a crowd. He had that quiet, unassuming look, a bit taller than average, with messy brown hair, and the kind of face you'd forget the second you looked away. But he was cool, you know, easy to talk to. We bonded over video games mostly. He was crazy good at them too. Like, embarrassingly good. I remember thinking he probably spent way too much time playing, but who was I to judge? We both were majoring in computer science, so we had a lot of the same classes. Group projects were a breeze when James was around. He could code like a machine, and he always had a knack for finding solutions that I would have never thought of. But as we got closer, I noticed something a little off about him. Nothing major at first, just small things that didn't seem right. It started with his phone. He had this habit of getting super paranoid whenever a notification popped up. He'd glance at it, swipe it away, and shove the phone into his pocket, like he was hiding something. I chalked it up to personal stuff. Everyone has their secrets, right? But then there were the times he'd disappear for hours, sometimes days, without a word. When he'd finally show up, he'd always have some vague excuse. Family stuff, or needed to get away for a bit. Again, not totally unusual, but it was enough to plant that first seed of doubt. The turning point came one night after a typical Friday hangout. We'd been drinking a little, nothing too crazy, just enough to loosen up. James started talking about the deep web. I'd heard of it, obviously. Who hasn't? But I'd never really given it much thought beyond the usual urban legends and horror stories. James, though, he spoke about it with this weird mix of fascination and disdain. I could show you how to get on it if you want, he said, his voice a little slurred. But trust me, it's not what you think. It's not just drugs and guns. It's darker. I laughed it off, assuming he was just trying to freak me out. But he didn't laugh back. He just stared at me, his eyes slightly unfocused, but dead serious. There's stuff on there that'll mess you up if you're not careful, he continued, almost like he was warning me. People on there aren't who they seem. They're not playing games. I remember feeling a chill run down my spine at the way he said it, but I shook it off, blaming it on the alcohol. Still, I couldn't help but feel a little creeped out. I mean, James was my friend. Why would he want to scare me like that? But then he dropped it, like the conversation never happened. We went back to joking around, talking about nonsense, and I eventually forgot about the whole thing. Well, I tried to. Anyway, but that uneasy feeling lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me whenever James went off the grid for a while or got too intense about his coding projects. Things started to get really weird a few weeks later. James had been MIA for a couple of days, which wasn't that unusual by this point. But when he came back, he looked different. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and there was this tense, wired energy about him, like he'd been up for days without sleep. He didn't say much that day, just nodded along as I talked about class, gaming, whatever. But I noticed his hands were trembling slightly, and every time his phone buzzed, he'd flinch like someone had just screamed in his ear. I should have pressed him on it, asked him what the hell was going on, but I didn't. Instead, I told myself it was none of my business and left it alone. But that was the last time I saw James, before everything went to hell. It was around midnight a few days later when I got a message from him. It was weird because he rarely texted. He preferred face-to-face, or at least a call. The message was short, just a location pin dropped in the middle of a neighborhood I didn't recognize. Come alone. That was it. No explanation, no context, just those two words. My gut instinct was to ignore it, but something about the tone made me curious, and, if I'm being honest, a little scared. So, like an idiot, I grabbed my jacket, threw on some shoes, and headed out. When I got there, I realized the location was a rundown apartment complex at the edge of town, the kind of place you avoid if you don't want trouble. I had no idea what James was doing there, but I figured I'd find out soon enough. As I walked through the dimly lit corridors, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Every shadow seemed to move, and every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I was about to turn back, but then I saw him. James was standing at the end of the hall, his back to me, staring at one of the doors. I called out to him, but he didn't respond, just stood there, frozen. I moved closer, and that's when I noticed the door he was staring at was slightly ajar. The number on the door was scratched off, but someone had scribbled it back on in what looked like a permanent marker. The smell of something rotten wafted out from the crack in the door, making my stomach churn. "James?" I said, my voice trembling. He turned to look at me, and I swear, I almost ran right then and there. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes, they were dead, like he wasn't really there. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice hollow. "It's too late now." Before I could ask what he meant, he pushed the door open and stepped inside, and like the idiot I was, I followed him. The stench hit me full force as I crossed the threshold, and I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. The apartment was dark, with only a flickering light bulb in the corner, providing any illumination. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what was on the walls. Photos. Hundreds of them. They were all of people. Different people. All ages, races, everything. Some of the photos looked like they'd been taken in secret. Others were posed, and a few were, well, they were too disturbing to describe. In the center of the room, there was a single laptop, the screen glowing eerily in the darkness. James walked over to it and sat down, his hands shaking as he typed something in. The screen flashed, and then an image popped up. A grainy video feed of a man tied to a chair, struggling against his bonds. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't some prank or horror movie scene. This was real. And then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, muffled scream coming from somewhere in the apartment. James turned to look at me, his face expressionless. "I told you not to come," he said quietly. "Now you're part of it too." I stood there frozen, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the filthy carpet. James's words echoed in my head, and the realization that I'd just walked into something much darker than I could ever imagine began to sink in. The stench in the room seemed to thicken, the sour odor of rot and something metallic clinging to the air. James didn't say anything more. He just turned back to the laptop, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the same eerie precision that he used when coding. But there was something almost mechanical about it now, like he was on autopilot. I forced myself to move, inching closer to the screen, and that's when I saw the name of the website in the corner. It was something I'd never heard of, one of those random strings of letters and numbers that deep websites use to stay hidden. But what caught my eye was the title of the page, The Silent Market. My stomach churned as I scanned the screen, taking in the listings, hit jobs, kidnappings, trafficking. This was a marketplace for death, a place where people bid on human lives like they were commodities. "James, what the hell is this?" I whispered, though I could barely get the words out. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled up the video feed again, the one with the man tied to the chair. The camera was shaky, like it had been set up in a hurry, but I could make out the guy's face. He was terrified, his eyes wide with panic, his mouth gagged with a strip of duct tape. The room he was in looked similar to the one we were standing in, but not identical. Somewhere else in this decrepit building, this man was fighting for his life. "I didn't want to get you involved," James finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I really didn't, but I'm in too deep. There's no way out." My mind raced as I tried to piece together what he was saying. James, my quiet, geeky friend, was somehow mixed up in this nightmare. But why? How? I needed answers, and I needed them fast. "James, you need to tell me what's going on," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What is this? How did you get into this?" He glanced at me, his eyes hollow. "It started as a side gig, just some extra cash doing harmless coding jobs on the deep web. But then I got noticed by someone. They liked my work, offered me more money than I'd ever seen to do other things." He paused, swallowing hard, as if he was trying to force down the guilt. "It was easy at first, just writing scripts, setting up servers, things like that. I told myself it wasn't hurting anyone, but then they started asking for more, tracking people, hacking into accounts, gathering information, and then the jobs turned darker." My heart pounded in my chest as he continued. I could feel the walls closing in around us, the darkness in the room becoming suffocating. "I should have stopped," he muttered, almost to himself. "But I didn't. I couldn't. They threatened me. They knew everything about me, about my family. I didn't have a choice. I had to do what they asked, or they'd come after me." I took a step back, the reality of what James was saying hitting me like a freight train. He wasn't just some coder who got in over his head. He was working for these people, helping them hunt down and hurt others. And now, somehow, I was caught up in it too. "What do you mean, I'm part of it?" I asked, dread settling in my stomach like a lead weight. James looked at me with a mixture of guilt and fear. "They know you're here. They know who you are. They're watching." My blood ran cold. I spun around, half expecting to see a camera in the corner of the room, or a pair of eyes peering through the cracked door. But there was nothing, just the suffocating silence and the eerie flicker of the laptop screen. "You need to leave," James said suddenly, his voice urgent. "Now, get out of here, and don't look back. Forget you ever knew me. Forget all of this." But I couldn't just leave. Not when I knew what was happening. Not when someone's life was on the line. Or what about the guy in the video? Is he here? James nodded slowly. "They're using this building Different rooms for different clients. It's all arranged through the site. The clients pick a target, and I help set it up. But you don't understand. It's too late for him. It's too late for both of us. Before I could react, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized someone was coming. James's eyes widened, and he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You need to hide," he hissed. "They'll kill you if they find you." I barely had time to process what was happening before James shoved me toward a closet in the corner of the room. I stumbled inside, the door closing with a soft click just as the footsteps reached the door. Through the narrow slats in the closet door, I watched as the door creaked open and a figure stepped inside. The man was tall, dressed in black from head to toe, with a hood pulled low over his face. He carried a small, unmarked duffel bag, and the way he moved, slow, deliberate, sent chills down my spine. "Is everything ready?" the man asked, his voice deep and emotionless. James nodded, his face pale as a ghost. "Yeah, it's all set," the man grunted, dropping the duffel bag onto the floor with a heavy thud. He unzipped it, and I caught a glimpse of what was inside. Knives, syringes, and other tools I couldn't identify, all laid out in neat, terrifying rows. "Good," the man said, his voice cold. "The clients paid a lot for this one. Make sure it's clean." I had to bite down on my hand to keep from making a sound as the man picked up one of the knives, testing the blade with a practiced flick of his wrist. My entire body trembled with fear, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. James didn't say anything, just stood there, frozen, as the man started preparing for whatever gruesome task lay ahead. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the regret, the fear, but he didn't move. He didn't stop it. And then, without warning, the man turned and headed toward the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I prayed he wouldn't check the closet, wouldn't find me cowering inside like a trapped animal. But he didn't even glance in my direction. Instead, he turned back to James, his voice low and menacing. "Remember, if you screw this up, you're next." With that, he was gone, leaving James standing there, shaking like a leaf. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I dared to move, pushing the closet door open just enough to see James staring at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though I couldn't tell if he was talking to me or to himself. "I'm so sorry." I didn't know what to do, what to say. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. But one thing was clear. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out before it was too late. But as I stepped out of the closet, my foot caught on something, sending a stack of papers tumbling to the floor. The noise echoed through the room, and James's head snapped up, his eyes wide with terror. Before either of us could react, the door burst open again, and the man in black was back, his eyes locking onto mine with a predatory gleam. "You," he snarled, taking a step forward, his hand reaching for the knife at his belt. "You shouldn't have come here." Panic surged through me, my mind screaming at me to run, to fight, to do anything but stand there like a deer in headlights. But it was too late. I was trapped, and I was next. Time seemed to slow down as the man in black took another step toward me, his hand tightening around the handle of the knife. My mind raced, desperate for a way out, but all I could think about was how stupid I'd been to come here in the first place. I should have left when I had the chance. Now I was staring down death itself, Run! James's voice broke through the fog of terror, snapping me back to reality. I didn't need to be told twice. Without thinking, I turned and bolted toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit and seemingly endless. My footsteps echoed off the walls, blending with the heavy thud of the man's boots as he chased after me. I didn't dare look back. All I could do was run, praying that I'd find a way out before he caught up. But this building was a maze, a twisted labyrinth of identical corridors and doors that led nowhere. Every corner I turned, every door I tried, only led to more darkness, more dead ends. I could feel the man gaining on me, his presence like a shadow looming over my shoulder. Then just when I thought I was trapped, I spotted a stairwell at the end of the hall. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I threw myself at the door, flinging it open, and stumbled down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet in my desperation to escape. The stairwell was cold and damp, the concrete walls slick with moisture. The air was heavy, oppressive, making it hard to breathe, but I couldn't stop. I could hear the man behind me, his footsteps relentless, echoing through the narrow space. I needed to keep moving. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself in the basement, a sprawling, cavernous space filled with old, rusting machinery and piles of discarded junk. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. There was no way out. I was trapped. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath, the reality of my situation sinking in. There was no escape. The man would find me, and when he did, I didn't want to think about what would happen next. But then I heard something faint, almost imperceptible, coming from the far corner of the basement. It was a sound that didn't belong here, a soft rhythmic tapping, like metal against metal. My pulse quickened as I crept closer, the shadows swallowing me whole. As I rounded a massive piece of machinery, I saw it, a door, almost hidden in the darkness, partially obscured by a stack of old crates. It was made of thick metal, reinforced with heavy bolts, and looked like it hadn't been opened in years. But the sound was coming from the other side, steady and deliberate. For a moment, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to find another way out. But there was no time. The man in black was closing in, and this door was the only option I had left. I reached out, my hand trembling, as I gripped the rusted handle. It was ice cold to the touch, and I had to use all my strength to force it open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the basement like a death knell. I slipped through the narrow gap and pulled the door shut behind me, plunging myself into pitch black darkness. The tapping stopped immediately, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. I stood there, my back pressed against the cold metal door, straining to hear any sign of the man. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own ragged breathing, my heart thudding in my chest. Then I heard it, a voice, low and barely more than a whisper, coming from somewhere deep within the darkness. Help me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the voice repeated, more desperate this time. Please, help me. I fumbled for my phone, the small screen casting a feeble glow as I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the narrow concrete-walled tunnel that stretched out before me. The air was damp, filled with the musty scent of decay and something else, something sour and acrid. Is someone there? I called out, my voice trembling. The silence was deafening, For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the voice, that the darkness was playing tricks on me. But then it came again, louder, closer. Please, help me. I inched forward, the light from my phone barely piercing the shadows. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the earth. And as I walked, the smell grew stronger, more pungent, until it was almost unbearable. Then up ahead, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, each one stacked with what looked like old, crumbling boxes and jars. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the figure, slumped against the far wall, barely visible in the dim light. I approached slowly, my heart racing, the beam of my flashlight shaking as I tried to steady my hand. The figure was a man, his clothes tattered and dirty, his face hidden in the shadows. He was chained to the wall, his wrists and ankles bound with heavy, rusted cuffs. "Oh, please, help me," he whispered again, his voice weak and raspy. I felt a surge of pity and horror as I knelt beside him, trying to get a better look at his face. But as I reached out to touch him, his head snapped up, and I recoiled in shock. His eyes, those sunken, hollow eyes, were filled with terror, but there was something else there too, something far worse, a glimmer of madness, a soul broken beyond repair. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over his bones. He looked like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. "They'll come for you," he croaked, his voice barely more than a breath. "They always do. There's no escape." I stared at him, my mind reeling. Who was he? How long had he been down here? And who were they? Before I could ask, the door behind me creaked open, the sound of footsteps echoing down the tunnel. My blood turned to ice as I realized the man in black had found me. There was no way out, nowhere to hide. The man chained to the wall let out a low, broken laugh, the sound chilling me to the core. "It's too late," he murmured, his head drooping as if the last of his strength had finally left him. "They'll take you, just like they took me." I backed away, my mind screaming for a way out, but it was no use. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside the chamber. I pressed myself against the wall, praying the darkness would hide me, praying for a miracle. But then, the door swung open, and the man in black stepped inside, his cold eyes locking onto mine with that same predatory gleam. He didn't say a word, just moved toward me, his knife gleaming in the dim light. This was it. I was done for. But just as he reached me, a sound echoed through the tunnel, something deep, rumbling, like the growl of a massive, unseen beast. The man froze, his eyes widening in fear, the knife trembling in his hand. Then out of the shadows, something emerged. It was huge, towering over both of us, its shape obscured by the darkness. But I could see its eyes, burning, malevolent eyes that seemed to pierce through my very soul. The man in black turned to run, but it was too late. The thing moved with impossible speed, a blur of darkness and teeth, and before I could even register what was happening, it was on him. The man's scream was cut short, the sound swallowed by the darkness as the creature dragged him back into the shadows. I was frozen in place, too terrified to move, too terrified to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone, leaving nothing but silence and darkness in its wake. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted out of the chamber, my legs carrying me faster than I thought possible, back through the tunnel, up the stairs, and out of that cursed building. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, my lungs burning, my mind racing with the horrors I just witnessed. I didn't know what that thing was, what it had done with the man in black, or what had happened to James. All I knew was that I needed to disappear, to get as far away from that place as possible, and never, ever look back. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Whatever I had stumbled into, whatever dark web of secrets and death James had dragged me into, it wasn't done with me yet. And somehow, I knew it would only be a matter of time before it came for me again. It had been a week since that night, and I hadn't slept a single peaceful hour. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the man in black, the chained victim, and that thing, that creature, lurking in the shadows. My dreams were plagued with nightmares so vivid that waking up was almost as terrifying as the dreams themselves. I kept expecting someone to show up at my door, to drag me back to that hellish building, but no one came. Instead, my paranoia grew, gnawing away at me until I couldn't even trust the safety of my own home. I kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked, but it didn't help. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside sent me into a panic. I tried to keep my routine as normal as possible, going to classes and pretending like everything was fine, but it wasn't. I was always looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to happen. My friends noticed the change in me, but I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I explain what I had seen without sounding insane? So I lied, told them I was just stressed out, overwhelmed by school. They bought it, most of them, anyway. But even when I was surrounded by people, I felt completely and utterly alone. Then one evening, as I sat at my desk trying to focus on a project, my phone buzzed. The sound was like a jolt of electricity through my nerves. I stared at the screen, the familiar number on display, my heart skipping a beat. It was a text from James. For a moment, I couldn't move. It was like my body refused to process what I was seeing. But then, curiosity and fear propelled me into action. I swiped the screen and opened the message. Meet me at the old campus library. Midnight. Don't tell anyone. The old library had been abandoned for years, a relic of the university's past that no one bothered to renovate. It was the kind of place that students used to dare each other to visit on Halloween, full of dusty old books and creaky floors. Now, it was just another empty building on the edge of campus. I should have ignored the message. I should have deleted it and pretended it never existed. But a part of me needed answers. A part of me needed to know what had happened to James, and more importantly, why I was still alive. Midnight came, and I found myself standing outside the old library, the cold night air biting through my jacket. The building loomed in front of me, its windows dark, its facade covered in ivy and neglect. I hesitated, my breath clouding in the air, before pushing the door open. The inside was just as I remembered, rows of dusty shelves, empty desks, and that distinct smell of old paper and wood. The only sound was the creak of the floorboards under my feet as I walked deeper into the building, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I found James sitting at one of the long tables in the main reading room, his head bowed, his hands clasped together on the table like he was praying. He looked worse than before, gaunt, his skin pale and sickly under the harsh light. He didn't look up when I approached, just sat there, staring at nothing. "James," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What the hell is going on?" He finally looked up, his eyes hollow, haunted. "I didn't think you'd come," he murmured, "but I'm glad you did. I need to tell you the truth, before it's too late." I pulled out a chair and sat across from him, my heart pounding in my chest. Too late for what? He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black USB drive. He placed it on the table between us, staring at it like it was a ticking time bomb. This is everything, he said, his voice cracking. All the files, the contracts, the transactions. It's all on here. The silent market, the people behind it, the clients. I copied it all before they could lock me out. I've been trying to find a way out, but there's no escape. They're coming for me, and when they do, they'll come for you too. My stomach twisted as I looked at the drive, the weight of what it represented sinking in. This wasn't just some urban legend or deep web horror story. This was real, and it was bigger than anything I could have imagined. Why me? I asked, my voice barely steady. Why did you drag me into this? James closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. I didn't mean to. I thought I could protect you, keep you out of it. But when you came that night, when you saw what you saw, they marked you. They knew you were involved, and now they want to tie up loose ends. A cold chill ran down my spine. Marked? What do you mean? He looked at me, his eyes full of regret. You're a target now, just like the others. They'll hunt you down, make you disappear. They have ways of finding you, no matter where you go. They have things working for them, things that aren't human. My mind flashed back to the creature in the basement, the thing that had taken the man in black. What was that thing, James? What are we dealing with? His face paled even more, if that was possible. I don't know. All I know is that it's part of their operation, part of how they keep people in line. It's not just about money or power. There's something darker at play, something ancient. The silent market isn't just a place to buy and sell death. It's a gateway, a portal to something far worse. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and the picture they formed was something out of a nightmare. What do we do? I asked, my voice shaking. How do we stop them? James looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the old James, the one who would stay up all night coding, laughing at stupid jokes, just a regular guy. But that flicker was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the hollow shell he had become. There's no stopping them, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. But maybe we can buy some time. The files on this drive, they're a death sentence if they get out. If we can get them to the right people, maybe we can expose the market, bring it down from the inside. But it's a long shot, and it's dangerous. They'll kill anyone who tries. Before I could respond, a low creak echoed through the library, the sound of the front door opening. James's eyes widened in terror, and he shoved the USB drive into my hands. Go, he hissed. Take it and run. Don't stop. Don't look back. They're here. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed the drive and bolted from the table, my heart hammering in my chest. As I reached the hallway, I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, heading toward the reading room. I risked a glance back and saw them. 2 figures dressed in black, their faces hidden in the shadows. They moved with a cold precision, weapons glinting in the faint light. And then, to my horror, I heard James scream, a sound so filled with fear and pain that it would haunt me the rest of my life. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran through the darkened corridors. My only thought was to get out, to survive. The sound of James's screams echoed through the building. followed by a sickening silence that made my blood run cold. I didn't know what they had done to him, and I didn't want to find out. I burst through the front doors of the library and into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I kept running, the USB drive clutched tightly in my hand, my breath ragged and painful in my chest. I didn't stop until I was far from the campus, far from the library, and far from whatever horrors were lurking in the shadows. But as I slowed to a walk, my mind still racing, I realized the terrifying truth. I had no idea where to go, no idea who I could trust. I was on the run, hunted by a shadowy organization that could reach me wherever I went, and the only thing keeping me alive was a small piece of plastic and metal that held more secrets than I could comprehend. I had entered a world of darkness, a world that had already consumed James, and now it was coming for me. And deep down, I knew there was no escaping it. It had been a week since that night, and I hadn't slept a single peaceful hour. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the man in black, the chained victim, and that thing, that creature, lurking in the shadows. My dreams were plagued with nightmares so vivid that waking up was almost as terrifying as the dreams themselves. I kept expecting someone to show up at my door, to drag me back to that hellish building, but no one came. Instead, my paranoia grew, gnawing away at me until I couldn't even trust the safety of my own home. I kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked, but it didn't help. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside sent me into a panic. I tried to keep my routine as normal as possible, going to classes and pretending like everything was fine, but it wasn't. I was always looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to happen. My friends noticed the change in me, but I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I explain what I had seen without sounding insane? So I lied, told them I was just stressed out, overwhelmed by school. They bought it, most of them anyway. But even when I was surrounded by people, I felt completely and utterly alone. Then one evening, as I sat at my desk trying to focus on a project, my phone buzzed. The sound was like a jolt of electricity through my nerves. I stared at the screen, the familiar number on display, my heart skipping a beat. It was a text from James. For a moment, I couldn't move. It was like my body refused to process what I was seeing. But then, curiosity and fear propelled me into action. I swiped the screen and opened the message. Meet me at the old campus library. Midnight. Don't tell anyone. The old library had been abandoned for years, a relic of the university's past that no one bothered to renovate. It was the kind of place that students used to dare each other to visit on Halloween, full of dusty old books and creaky floors. Now, it was just another empty building on the edge of campus. I should have ignored the message. I should have deleted it and pretended it never existed. But a part of me needed answers. A part of me needed to know what had happened to James, and more importantly, why I was still alive. Midnight came, and I found myself standing outside the old library, the cold night air biting through my jacket. The building loomed in front of me, its windows dark, its facade covered in ivy and neglect. I hesitated, my breath clouding in the air, before pushing the door open. The inside was just as I remembered. Rows of dusty shelves, empty desks, and that distinct smell of old paper and wood. The only sound was the creak of the floorboards under my feet as I walked deeper into the building, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I found James sitting at one of the long tables in the main reading room, his head bowed, his hands clasped together on the table like he was praying. He looked worse than before, gaunt, his skin pale and sickly under the harsh light. He didn't look up when I approached, just sat there, staring at nothing. "James," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What the hell is going on?" He finally looked up, his eyes hollow. "Haunted. I didn't think you'd come," he murmured. "But I'm glad you did. I need to tell you the truth before it's too late." I pulled out a chair and sat across from him, my heart pounding in my chest. Too late for what? He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black USB drive. He placed it on the table between us, staring at it like it was a ticking time bomb. This is everything," he said, his voice cracking. "All the files, the contracts, the transactions. It's all on here. The silent market, the people behind it, the clients. I copied it all before they could lock me out. I've been trying to find a way out, but there's no escape. They're coming for me. And when they do, they'll come for you too." My stomach twisted as I looked at the drive, the weight of what it represented sinking in. This wasn't just some urban legend or deep web horror story. This was real, and it was bigger than anything I could have imagined. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Why did you drag me into this?" James closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. "I didn't mean to. I thought I could protect you, keep you out of it. But when you came that night, when you saw what you saw, they mocked you. They knew you were involved. And now they want to tie up loose ends." A cold chill ran down my spine. "Marked? What do you mean?" He looked at me, his eyes full of regret. "You're a target now, just like the others. They'll hunt you down, make you disappear. They have ways of finding you, no matter where you go. They have things working for them, things that aren't human." My mind flashed back to the creature in the basement, the thing that had taken the man in black. What was that thing, James? What are we dealing with? His face paled even more, if that was possible. "I don't know. All I know is that it's part of their operation, part of how they keep people in line. It's not just about money or power. There's something darker at play, something ancient. The silent market isn't just a place to buy and sell death. It's a gateway, a portal to something far worse." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and the picture they formed was something out of a nightmare. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How do we stop them?" James looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the old James, the one who would stay up all night coding, laughing at stupid jokes, just a regular guy. But that flicker was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the hollow shell he had become. "There's no stopping them," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But maybe we can buy some time. The files on this drive, they're a death sentence if they get out. If we can get them to the right people, maybe we can expose the market, bring it down from the inside. But it's a long shot, and it's dangerous. They'll kill anyone who tries." Before I could respond, a low creak echoed through the library, the sound of the front door opening. James's eyes widened in terror, and he shoved the USB drive into my hands. "Go," he hissed. "Take it and run. Don't stop. Don't look back. They're here." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed the drive and bolted from the table, my heart hammering in my chest. As I reached the hallway, I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, heading toward the reading room. I risked a glance back and saw them, 2 figures dressed in black, their faces hidden in the shadows. They moved with a cold precision, weapons glinting in the faint light. And then, to my horror, I heard James scream, a sound so filled with fear and pain that it would haunt me for the rest of my life. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran through the darkened corridors. My only thought was to get out, to survive. The sound of James's screams echoed through the building, followed by a sickening silence that made my blood run cold. I didn't know what they had done to him, and I didn't want to find out. I burst through the front doors of the library and into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I kept running, the USB drive clutched tightly in my hand, my breath ragged and painful in my chest. I didn't stop until I was far from the campus, far from the library, and far from whatever horrors were lurking in the shadows. But as I slowed to a walk, my mind still racing, I realized the terrifying truth. I had no idea where to go, no idea who I could trust. I was on the run, hunted by a shadowy organization that could reach me wherever I went, and the only thing keeping me alive was a small piece of plastic and metal that held more secrets than I could comprehend. I had entered a world of darkness, a world that had already consumed James, and now it was coming for me. And deep down, I knew there was no escaping it. I didn't sleep that night, or any night after. Instead, I kept moving, changing locations every few hours, trying to stay one step ahead of the shadowy figures I knew were hunting me. Paranoia became my constant companion. Every face in the crowd was a potential enemy. Every car that followed too closely could be carrying a killer. But the worst part was the silence, the waiting. It was as if the world had gone quiet, holding its breath before something terrible. I didn't know where to go, so I reached out to the only person I thought might be able to help, Professor Daniels. He was an old-school hacker turned cybersecurity professor, someone who'd seen and done it all back in the day. If anyone could help me with the USB drive, it was him. We met in the early hours of the morning at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the town. The place was almost empty, the smell of burnt coffee hanging in the air. Professor Daniels was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth at the back, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as I approached, his eyes narrowing as he saw the state I was in. "Jesus, kid," he muttered as I slid into the seat opposite him. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I've seen worse," I replied, my voice hoarse. I handed him the USB drive, my hands still trembling. "I need you to look at this. It's important." Daniels eyed the drive for a moment before nodding. He pulled out his laptop, an old battered machine that looked like it had survived a war, and plugged the drive in. For a few minutes, he worked in silence, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. Finally, he leaned back, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Where the hell did you get this?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. This is some next level shit. Military grade encryption, hidden partitions, and the stuff I can see. Kid, this is bad. Really bad." "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But I need to know what's on it. All of it." Daniels hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but if we do this, there's no going back. You understand that, right? Once I start digging, they'll know. They'll come after both of us." I nodded, feeling a cold dread settle in my stomach. "I know. Just do it." Daniels got to work. his eyes glued to the screen as he navigated through layers of encryption and firewalls. I watched as lines of code scrolled across the monitor, incomprehensible to me, but clearly significant to him. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. Then finally, he stopped, his face pale. He looked up at me, his expression a mix of fear and disbelief. "Holy shit," he whispered. This is a kill list. Names, addresses, details, everything. Politicians, CEOs, journalists, and regular people too. Anyone who's ever crossed these guys, or even just gotten in their way. And, oh God. What? I leaned forward, my heart pounding. What is it? Daniels turned the laptop around so I could see the screen. There, near the bottom of the list, was my name, and James's. My blood ran cold as I stared at it, the final, undeniable proof that I was a marked man. "They're not just after you," Daniel said, his voice grim. "They've already started. Some of these people, they're already dead. And it's not just the hitmen. There's something else here, something I can't quite crack, but it's big, bigger than anything I've ever seen." I swallowed hard, the enormity of the situation crashing down on me. "Can you do anything with this? Can we stop them?" Daniels hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he thought it over. "Maybe, if we can get this to the right people who can expose it, shut it down, it might buy us some time, but it's a long shot. These guys, they're everywhere. They have connections in places you wouldn't believe." "Then we have to try," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "We have to do something." Daniels nodded, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. "All right, kid, but first, we need to get out of here. They've probably already traced us to this location. We need to move fast." We left the diner, my pulse racing as we slipped into the shadows of the early morning. Daniels led me to his car, an old beat-up sedan that looked like it had seen better days, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. We drove in silence, the city lights fading into the distance as we headed toward the outskirts, where Daniel said he had a safe house, a place where we could lay low and figure out our next move. But we didn't make it far. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed the headlights behind us, getting closer and closer. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing the black SUV tailing us, its lights glaring like the eyes of a predator. "Daniels," I said, my voice tight with fear. "We're being followed." Daniels glanced in the mirror, his face paling. "Damn it. Hold on." He floored the gas pedal, the old sedan roaring to life as we sped down the highway. But the SUV was faster, gaining on us with terrifying speed. My mind raced, thinking of all the ways this could end, none of them good. And then, out of nowhere, the SUV rammed into our rear bumper, sending us skidding across the road. I grabbed the door handle, my knuckles white, as I braced for impact. We swerved, the tires screeching, but Daniels managed to regain control just before we hit the guardrail. "They're trying to run us off the road," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "No shit," Daniel snapped, his eyes darting between the road and the mirror. "We need to lose them, now." But there was no losing them. The SUV rammed us again, harder this time, and I could feel the car starting to lose traction. We were careening toward the edge of the road, toward a steep drop that would be the end of us. And then out of nowhere, there was a blinding flash of light, followed by a deafening roar. The SUV swerved violently, and for a split second, I saw something, a shadowy figure, massive and inhuman, emerging from the darkness on the side of the road. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But there it was, the same creature I had seen in the basement. its eyes burning with an unnatural light as it reached out toward the SUV. The vehicle spun out of control, veering off the road and flipping over the edge with a sickening crunch of metal. We skidded to a stop, the sedan shuddering as Daniel slammed on the brakes. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. We sat there in stunned silence. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the distant hiss of steam from the wreckage below. What the hell was that? I stammered, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. Daniels didn't answer, his eyes wide with shock as he stared out the windshield. But then, slowly, he turned to me, his expression one of grim realization. I think it just saved us, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. But why? I couldn't answer. All I knew was that we had to keep moving. Whatever that thing was, whatever dark forces were at play, we couldn't afford to stop now. We drove in silence, our nerves frayed, until we reached Daniel's safe house, a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods. It was a place where no one would find us, a place where we could plan our next move. But as I stepped out of the car, a cold wind swept through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows, just beyond the tree line. Daniels was already heading towards the cabin, his mind focused on the task at hand. But I lingered for a moment, staring into the darkness, my heart heavy with dread. And then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, far off in the distance, watching us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. They weren't human, but they weren't the same as the creature I had seen before either. These eyes were different, more intelligent, more malevolent. They blinked once, then vanished into the night. I hurried into the cabin, locking the door behind me, trying to shake the feeling that I was being hunted. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever James had uncovered, whatever dark secrets were hidden within the silent market, they weren't going to let us go. We had seen too much, and now we were part of the game. A game with no rules, no mercy, and no way out. And as I sat down beside Daniels, staring at the USB drive that held our only hope, I realized that the real horror wasn't what I had seen, but what was yet to come. Because in the end, you can't outrun the darkness. You can only hope to survive it. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys exploring the darker corners of the internet, not in a malicious or illegal way, but more out of curiosity. You know the type. Deep dives into conspiracy theories, urban legends, and weird online communities. It's not like I believe most of the stuff I find, but there's something fascinating about the bizarre and the unexplained that just draws me in. But what happened a few weeks ago? I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. It all started when I stumbled upon a post on a small obscure forum dedicated to weird internet challenges. The post was titled, "Don't play the Mr. Beast game on the deep web. You have been warned." The username of the person who posted it was ghost_runner74, and it immediately caught my attention. Mr. Beast, the YouTuber known for his wild challenges and huge cash giveaways. What could he possibly have to do with the deep web? The post was short and to the point, but it carried a weight that felt more like a warning than the usual clickbait nonsense. It went something like this. Hey, if you value your sanity, don't go looking for the Mr. Beast game on the deep web. It's not like his usual stuff, trust me. It's something else entirely, something twisted. I'm not joking, this isn't a prank. This game isn't what you think it is. It's dangerous. Just stay away. Most people would probably have rolled their eyes and moved on, but not me. My curiosity was piqued. Maybe it was some new ARG, alternate reality game, or just some fan-made horror game. Either way, I was intrigued, and stupidly, I wanted to find it. I've always been fairly tech-savvy, so navigating the deep web wasn't new to me. I booted up my laptop, connected to my VPN, and fired up the Tor browser. After some digging, which involved browsing through sketchy forums and following cryptic links, I finally found what I was looking for. A link simply labeled Mr. Beast's Game. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would I be stupid enough to click on that? But you have to understand, at that moment, I wasn't thinking about the potential consequences. I was thinking about the thrill of the unknown, the excitement of discovering something before anyone else, the adrenaline rush of doing something I knew was risky, but just couldn't resist. So I clicked the link. The screen went black for a moment, and then a loading bar appeared, with the words initializing written above it. My heart started pounding. This wasn't like the usual deep web experience. It felt polished, almost professional, yet there was something unsettling about it. The loading bar moved slowly, like it was trying to build suspense. When it finally finished, a simple retro-style title screen appeared. It was like one of those old 8-bit games with the words Mr. Beast Challenge written in pixelated text. Beneath it were two options, play and leave. Of course, I clicked play. As soon as I did, my webcam light flickered on. I hadn't given the game permission to access my camera, and that should have been my first red flag. But instead of freaking out, I leaned in closer, trying to figure out what was going on. The screen changed to show a pixelated version of Mr. Beast, standing in front of a crowd of what looked like random people. He raised his hand in a wave, and a text box appeared beneath him. Welcome to the Ultimate Mr. Beast Challenge. Are you ready to play? I hit enter on my keyboard, and that's when things started getting weird. The screen glitched for a second, and the people standing behind Mr. Beast, they weren't just sprites anymore. They were real. I could see their faces, their eyes staring blankly ahead, almost like they were trapped. But I told myself it was just some advanced graphics, maybe pre-recorded video clips integrated into the game. After all, Mr. Beast is known for pushing the boundaries of what's possible, right? A new text box popped up. Here's the challenge. Survive the night. I sat back, confused. Survive the night? What did that mean? Was it some kind of horror survival game? Before I could process it further, the game automatically moved on to the next screen. It was my room, my actual room, my bed, my desk, even the posters on my wall. Everything was pixelated, but recognizable. I felt my throat tighten. How could this game know what my room looked like? Was it using my webcam? But no, this was more detailed than anything a webcam could capture. It was like someone had been in my room and mapped it out. The screen flashed again, and this time there was a timer at the top, counting down from 6 hours. Beneath the timer, a new message appeared. Survive until dawn. Don't let them find you. And then it began. I heard footsteps coming from the game, but they weren't just in the game. They were in my house. I didn't know what to do. The footsteps were unmistakable, growing louder with each passing second. At first, I thought it was just the game's sound effects messing with my head. But the more I listened, the more I realized they weren't coming from my speakers. They were coming from the hallway outside my room. I quickly muted my computer, but the footsteps continued. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I hadn't felt fear like this in years, and for a moment, I considered shutting everything down, maybe even calling someone. But who would I call? The cops? What would I tell them? That a game from the deep web was making me hear things? Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I checked my door. I had locked it earlier, out of habit, but now I was grateful for that small act of paranoia. The door was still locked, thank God, but the footsteps stopped, right outside my room. I held my breath, pressing my ear against the door, hoping to catch any sound, but there was nothing, just an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to the quiet, trying to convince myself that it was all just in my head. Maybe the game had triggered some sort of auditory hallucination, a side effect of my overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This was real. Finally, I mustered the courage to turn back to my computer. The screen had gone dark, but the timer was still counting down, now showing 5 hours left. A new message flashed across the screen. They're here. Don't let them in. My stomach dropped. What the hell was this game? This wasn't just some stupid ARG or a horror-themed prank. This felt personal. It felt like the game was targeting me, like it knew who I was and where I lived. The screen flickered, and then a new image appeared. It was the hallway outside my room, pixelated and grainy but unmistakable. I could see the silhouette of a figure standing just out of view, right where the footsteps had stopped. I blinked, and the figure moved closer, creeping into the light cast by the bulb outside my door. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of something tall and thin. It didn't move like a normal person. Its movements were jerky, almost like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like something was terribly, horribly wrong. The figure stopped in front of my door. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring as if it could see me through the screen. I didn't dare move. I barely breathed, and then, slowly, it reached out, its hand hovering inches from the doorknob. My doorknob. My hand instinctively flew to the knob on my side, gripping it tightly, as if my life depended on it. I could feel the cold metal beneath my fingers, the smoothness of it grounding me in reality. This was real. This was happening. The figure's hand paused, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it was going to turn the knob, that it was going to come in, but then it pulled back, retreating into the darkness of the hallway. The screen flashed again, and the image disappeared, replaced by the game's main view of my room. The only thing left was the timer, now showing 4.5 hours. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My body was trembling, my mind racing with questions and fear. What was this thing? Why was it at my door? And most importantly, how the hell was I supposed to survive the next 4 hours? I wanted to stop playing. I wanted to shut down my computer, unplug it, throw it out the window, anything to make this nightmare end. But I couldn't. The game had a hold on me, a grip so tight, I felt like I was suffocating. I was terrified of what might happen if I quit, if I broke the rules. So I sat there staring at the screen, waiting for whatever came next. The next hour was a blur. I kept expecting to hear more footsteps, to see that figure return, but nothing happened. The game seemed to be in a kind of lull, like it was waiting, watching me. biding its time. The silence was almost worse than the noise, the anticipation gnawing away at my nerves. Then just when I thought I might actually be able to catch my breath, the game screen flashed again. This time, the message was simple, direct. Round 2. Check the closet. My heart skipped a beat. The closet. I slowly turned to look at it, sitting innocuously in the corner of my room, the door slightly ajar. How long had it been open like that? Had I left it open? I knew what the game wanted me to do, but every instinct screamed at me not to. The closet was dark, the shadows inside shifting slightly, as if something was moving just out of sight. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost knocked over my chair as I stood up. Step by step, I inched closer to the closet, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The air felt thick, oppressive, like I was wading through molasses. My hand reached out, trembling, as it grasped the edge of the door. For a moment, I hesitated, fear paralyzing me, but I knew I had to do it. I had to know what was inside. With a quick motion, I yanked the door open. The closet was empty. I let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through me. Of course it was empty. What was I expecting? But then, as I started to close the door, something caught my eye. A piece of paper, folded neatly, resting on the floor. I picked it up, my hand still trembling. Unfolding it, I found a message written in neat, precise handwriting. 3 hours left. Don't look behind you. Every hair on my body stood on end. I could feel it, a presence, standing right behind me. The air grew colder, a chill creeping up my spine. My heart pounded in my chest so loud I could barely hear anything else. But I couldn't turn around. I wouldn't. The game had just begun. My hands clenched the paper so tightly that it crumpled into a ball, the edges digging into my palms. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The words on that paper echoed in my mind like a sinister chant. Don't look behind you. But the urge to turn around was overwhelming. It was like the fear was feeding off my curiosity, pushing me to see what was there. My rational mind fought back, reminding me that this was a game, that whatever was behind me wasn't real. But the chilling presence in the room said otherwise. Slowly, I backed up until I felt the edge of my desk against my thighs, trying to keep my breathing steady. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on my wall. I didn't dare glance at the screen, too afraid that doing so would give whatever was behind me the chance to close the distance. Instead, I stared straight ahead at the blank wall in front of me, the silence pressing down like a weight. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like hours. My legs were shaking, and sweat dripped down my forehead, stinging my eyes. The thought of what might happen if I turned around was almost too much to bear. But the alternative, standing there indefinitely, locked in this tense standoff, was equally unbearable. And then, the game spoke again. The soft click of my computer speakers jolted me out of my paralysis. My gaze flicked to the screen, where a new message had appeared in that familiar pixelated text. 3 hours left. Stay still. Stay still? What was that supposed to mean? I hadn't moved a muscle since I'd picked up that damn note, and yet the presence behind me felt closer, more oppressive. It was as if the very air in the room was being sucked away, leaving me gasping for breath. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second dragging on like a lifetime. I tried to focus on it, using the rhythm to ground myself, to keep the panic at bay. But no matter how hard I tried, the fear gnawed at my insides, relentless. Suddenly, the lights in my room flickered. My heart leapt into my throat As the darkness crept in around me, the shadows growing longer, deeper, the flickering became more erratic, and with each pulse of light, the room seemed to change, the shadows on the walls twisting into unnatural shapes. And then, the lights went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, so absolute that I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The only light came from the faint glow of my computer screen, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. I was frozen in place, my back pressed against the desk, staring at the screen like it was my last lifeline. The message was still there, taunting me. 3 hours left. Stay still. But how could I stay still when I knew something was there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to slip up? The shadows seemed to pulse with life, creeping closer with each passing second. I could feel the presence behind me more intensely now, its icy breath brushing against the back of my neck. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear was too much, the tension unbearable. I had to do something, anything, to break this terrifying stalemate. Slowly, I reached out with one hand, feeling along the desk for my phone. Maybe I could use it to light up the room, to banish the shadows, even just for a moment. My fingers brushed against the cold surface of my phone, and I grabbed it, fumbling to unlock it with trembling hands. The screen lit up, and I turned it on, hoping against hope that the light would give me some sense of security. But as soon as the light cut through the darkness, I wished I hadn't done it. The shadows around me shifted violently, and in that brief moment, I caught a glimpse of something that nearly stopped my heart. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs contorted into unnatural angles, stood just inches from me. Its face was shrouded in darkness, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me, cold and malevolent. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could scream, the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone, but the memory of its presence lingered, a cold dread settling in my bones. I dropped my phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The light of the screen faded as it hit the floor, leaving me once again in the glow of the computer. I didn't dare move, didn't dare look away from the screen. The timer now read 2 hours and 30 minutes. How was I supposed to survive this? The game had twisted reality, bringing something into my home, something that shouldn't be possible. I thought about quitting, turning off my computer, but the fear of what might happen if I broke the rules kept me glued to my seat. The lights in the room remained steady, but the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The timer continued its relentless countdown, and I knew I couldn't sit still forever. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't done with me yet, and I was running out of time. Time crawled forward, painfully slow, each second echoing louder in my mind. The room was unnervingly still, yet the weight of the presence hadn't lifted. It was like being watched from every corner, every shadow. Even though the lights had steadied, the tension remained, thick in the air, suffocating. I kept glancing at the timer on the screen. 2 hours left. That's when the game took another twisted turn. The message changed, the pixelated text flickering on the screen, as though it was struggling to stay coherent. It read, "Time's running out. The rules are changing." And then, without warning, the image on the screen shifted. It wasn't my room anymore. I stared in disbelief as it showed the hallway outside my door again. But this time, there was no shadowy figure lurking. Instead, I saw myself. I was standing in the hallway, pixelated like the game characters, frozen in place. My heart skipped a beat. How could I be in two places at once? Was this part of the game? some twisted way of messing with my head. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make sense of it. But the more I stared, the more I realized something even worse. The figure on the screen, the one that looked like me, wasn't entirely me. There were subtle differences, just enough to make my skin crawl. The way it stood, the angle of its head, the two long limbs. The game's version of me looked off, like a distorted reflection in a funhouse mirror. And then slowly, it began to move. My pulse quickened as I watched the doppelganger take a step forward toward my door. My door. I instinctively glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see it standing behind me. But the room was empty. I turned back to the screen just in time to see the figure reach out, its hand hovering inches from the doorknob. My doorknob rattled. I froze, staring at the door. It was locked, but the handle shook violently, as if something was desperately trying to get in. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The thing on the screen wasn't just part of the game anymore. It was trying to cross over. Another message popped up. Open the door and let yourself in. I almost laughed, a dry, humorless sound escaping my throat. Let myself in? Was this some kind of sick joke? But the rattling persisted, and with every passing second, it grew louder, more aggressive. The figure on the screen was pounding on the door now, and I could hear it echoing in real life, each bang sending shock waves of terror through my body. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to get up, to run, but my body refused to cooperate. I was paralyzed, stuck between the game and reality, caught in the web of whatever malevolent force was behind this. The knocking stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse than the noise. My breathing was shallow, the air in my lungs burning as I tried to calm down. Then a new sound, something subtle, barely perceptible at first. Scratching. It was coming from the door, long, slow scratches, like nails dragging across wood. My stomach churned, and I felt bile rise in the back of my throat. I glanced back at the screen. The doppelganger was gone. The hallway was empty. The message changed again, almost as if it was mocking me. Too late. Before I could process what that meant, I heard it. The unmistakable creak of the door opening behind me. My heart nearly stopped. The door was locked. I knew it was locked. But there it was, slowly swinging open, the hinges groaning like they hadn't been used in years. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. Instead, I stared at the screen, hoping for some clue, some indication of what was coming for me. But all it showed was my empty room, bathed in that faint, pixelated glow. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the floor behind me. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't real. It was just a game. Some messed up ARG designed to scare people. Right, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer, heavier, like whatever was in the room with me was dragging itself across the floor. My skin prickled, every hair on my body standing on end. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything other than sit there, waiting for whatever was coming. But I couldn't. The footsteps stopped, right behind me. What felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The air was cold, heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. I could feel it there, looming over me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. And then, so close that I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, it whispered, "Look at me." My heart thundered in my chest. Every fiber of my being told me not to turn around, not to look. But the whisper was insistent, growing louder, more demanding, with each repetition. Look at me. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to do as it said. I couldn't. I wouldn't. But then, the screen changed again, flashing a new message in bright, bold letters. Turn around, or the game ends. My stomach twisted in knots. I didn't know what the game ending meant, but the thought of breaking the rules filled me with dread. I had to see this through, whatever it was. Slowly, painfully, I started to turn my head, the fear gripping me so tightly I thought I might pass out. And that's when I saw it. Just over my shoulder, reflected in the dark screen of my powered-down phone, was a face, but not just any face. It was mine, twisted, distorted, grinning in a way no human face should ever be able to grin. And then, before I could react, the lights flickered again, and everything went black. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything around me. I couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was feel the cold, creeping dread that coiled around my spine, the oppressive weight of the air pressing down on me, and the icy, tingling sensation of something brushing against my skin. The only sound was the pounding of my heart, loud and erratic in the silence. The timer on the screen flickered back to life, illuminating the room with its dim, ominous glow. 1 hour left. The words flashed across the screen in bright, blood-red text. Final round. Face yourself. My throat tightened. Face myself. What did that even mean? I was still reeling from the sight of that twisted reflection. The image of my own face, distorted and grinning, burned into my mind. The presence behind me hadn't left. It was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting. But now, there was something else. A new sense of urgency, a tension that thickened the air. The lights in the room flickered back on, dim and shaky. Everything looked the same, yet somehow different. The shadows were darker. The corners of the room seemed to stretch impossibly far, and the walls felt like they were closing in. My breath caught in my throat as I realized something was wrong, terribly wrong. I glanced at the screen, hoping for some clue, some indication of what was coming next. The game had changed again. The room on the screen was no longer just a pixelated version of my own. It was alive. The walls shifted and breathed, the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes. And there, standing in the middle of it all, was that twisted doppelganger. But this time, it wasn't just standing still. It was moving. I watched in horror as it turned to face me. Its eyes, my eyes, glowing with an unnatural light. The grin on its face stretched wider, impossibly wide, as it began to walk toward the screen, toward me. Every step it took sent a shiver down my spine, the sound of its footsteps echoing in my ears. Mixing with the real footsteps I could hear approaching from behind. The timer on the screen ticked down to 59 minutes. The message changed. Face yourself, or let the darkness consume you. The footsteps behind me grew louder, more insistent. Whatever was in the room with me was getting closer, and the air grew colder with each passing second. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, caught between the horror on the screen and the one in the room. The figure on the screen stopped, just inches away, its face filling the monitor, so close I could see every detail of its twisted grin, every glint of malice in its eyes. It raised a hand, pressing it against the screen, and my blood ran cold as I saw it reach out through the screen, breaking the barrier between the game and reality. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what was happening. The figure's hand stretched out from the monitor, impossibly long and thin, its fingers clawing at the air. And then, as if by some terrible force of gravity, I felt myself being pulled towards it, drawn into the screen, into that dark, twisted version of my own reality. I tried to resist, planting my feet firmly on the ground, but it was no use. The force was too strong, too overwhelming. My body lurched forward, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of the screen, my face inches away from the doppelganger's. It stared at me, its eyes boring into mine, its grin widening with every second. "Face yourself," it whispered, the words seeping into my mind like poison. With a final surge of terror, I reached out and grabbed the edge of the desk, pulling myself back, away from the screen. But the doppelganger didn't relent. It pressed harder against the screen, its hand breaking through, fingers inches from my face. And then in one horrifying moment, it lunged at me. I screamed, stumbling backward, falling to the floor as the lights flickered and the room plunged into darkness once more. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the sound of whispering voices surrounding me, filling my ears with nonsensical words and laughter that wasn't my own. I could feel it, the doppelganger, the twisted reflection of myself, crawling closer, dragging itself across the floor, its fingers brushing against my leg. "Face yourself," it whispered again, but this time the voice was inside my head. Desperation clawed at me. I needed to end this, to escape, but how? The game had taken control, bending reality to its twisted will, and I was nothing but a puppet in its grasp. My mind raced, searching for any way out, any means of breaking free. And then it hit me. The game. It was all about survival, all about playing by the rules. But what if I changed the rules? With trembling hands, I reached for the power button on my computer. The whispers grew louder, the presence behind me pressing closer, its cold breath on the back of my neck. The doppelganger's hand wrapped around my ankle, its grip cold and relentless. I had to act fast. Before I could second-guess myself, I yanked the power cord from the wall. The screen went dark, the whispers stopped, and the grip on my ankle vanished. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the suffocating silence of the dark room. I lay there panting, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The room was still, empty. I slowly sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The clock on my wall ticked quietly, the only sound in the otherwise silent room. The computer was off, the screen blank and lifeless. The presence was gone, the cold air replaced by the normal warmth of my room. It was over, or so I thought. As I stood up, my legs shaking, I heard it. A single soft click. I turned around, and there, on the floor, was my phone. The screen had lit up, a message flashing across it in the same pixelated text as the game. "You can't escape yourself." And then the screen shattered. The last thing I remember is the sound of glass breaking, the cold, dark presence rushing toward me, and a final, bone-chilling whisper that echoed in the depths of my mind. Game over. When I woke up, it was morning. The room was bathed in sunlight, and everything seemed normal. My computer was back on, the game gone, as if it had never existed. But the fear, the dread remained, clawing at the edges of my mind. I never spoke of what happened that night. I couldn't. No one would believe me. But I know one thing for certain. I will never, ever go looking for answers on the deep web again. Because some things, some games, are meant to stay hidden. And no matter how curious you are, trust me, it's better not to play.